It's on. All right, good evening, good evening, good evening, good evening. Class 5, session number 5, Critical Race Theory, American University, School of Law, Washington College of Law. Let's do it. Um, all right, so let's start again. Questions, comments, concerns about anything that we've talked about, anything we haven't talked about, things that you might want to talk about. We talked about political ideologies and legal ideologies in the first couple classes, how the law thinks, a whole bunch of polysyllabic words, 3, 4, 5 syllable stuff that really, if you ask me, again, they all relate to stuff that we've known our whole lives. We just put all types of fancy words so regular people think that we're smart. But any questions about those political, legal ideologies, conservatism, textualism, formalism, realism, all that wonderful stuff?
I did
Okay.
have a
And then
question about, oh, sorry.
oh, was there a question, Miss Carol? No, no. Okay. And then we also spoke on last week. We talked about critiques of critical race theory, of which there are a lot. If we're to break them down all individually. So you can start by the fact that many critics of critical race theory will just start with a blanket slogan that it's neither critical nor is it a theory, right? That critical in the sense of critical legal study, CLS. Um, the argument there is that there are the law responds to lots of power bases, and that judges and legal actors act upon their biases, their own personal interests, their own personal senses of justice, rather than just following supposedly a logical deduction from previous cases and law. Um, that instead of the law determining the answer and it just being received by the legal actor, like the judge, on the other hand, says, I think it'll go this way and has their law clerk write it up. Um, there's a middle ground to all that. As again, I mentioned to some of you or all of you, I clerked for Judge Foley at the tax court. And one of the interesting things about writing tax court opinions is taxes are not very easy to categorize as liberal or conservative. Um, on the one hand, you could think of tax avoidance. I know a lot of liberals and progressives think tax avoidance is conservative, and I might agree on one hand, but I could also turn around and say that the responsibility to pay taxes as a moral duty tends to come from the right, as a moral exercise as far as maintaining a country to begin with. On the other hand, when we talk about the left, um, on the one hand, you could talk about how many ways a taxpayer should not have to pay for a government that subordinates, and the way in which poor people should be able to avoid taxes the same way that wealthy people should be able to are avoiding taxes, or that the tax system is upside down as far as too burdensome on poor or middle class people. At the same time, you could also be on the left or liberal and support higher taxes because you need those funds, and stricter enforcement because you need those funds to support the education, environmental programs that the government undertakes. So I say all that to say lots of tax issues, they really don't have a political answer. And moreover, some tax issues are so hyper technical, I, it doesn't invoke justice. I mean, who cares really whether it goes one way or the other? And I say all that to say that when you're dealing with cases that a judge does not personally have a lot of affection for, well, then what is the answer then? What process do they use to come up with an answer? And I think in those instances we can admit that on the one hand, perhaps they're not just receiving the law from some ethereal place on the one hand, and on the other hand, that it's not necessarily just their personal sense of justice that carries the day, and they just ignore all precedent behind them. There's a legal philosopher named Ronald Dworkin, who tried to marry the two, sort of formalism and criticism, or realism. He's sort of a critical theorist. He spans a lot of things. You can describe in a lot of ways. Um, and he tried to argue that what judges are doing is, yes, they do believe they're bound by principles in the past, but they do have freedom for the future. He says that you should think of judges as a serial author. So you can imagine that someone writes a play or a book or a movie, and that a different author then carries on to the second chapter. Indeed, that the second author goes and does the second chapter. That second author has freedom to write the next story, but it has to make sense coming after the stories behind it, right? So that kind of respect for the past, but then freedom to create in the future. All right, I've done a whole. I probably spent too much time on that because we got so many things to talk about this week. So questions, political legal ideologies, critiques of critical race theory. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
It's not
Mr.
necessarily one
Smelly.
of the it was not necessarily one of the critiques of critical race theory, but I really found it interesting
Oh,
reading about Mari Matsuda's.
I
Oh, can you
can't
not hear me?
hear. Can everyone else hear?
Mm,
Is it
Let
just
me
me?
try that. Is that
I can
better?
hear him.
Miss
Am I better?
Carol, I heard your, and I can't. Why can't I? Huh?
Uh-oh.
What is going on?
Um, Turn those off. See if that works. Um,
Okay, so all of you guys are in the mix, and I'm not. How does that happen? Let's see.
I hear you. Do you hear me? Are we? I can always just not comment.
All right, you guys, give me 2 seconds. I'm going to try to work some technical.
No, I can't hear you. Now you can hear me, but now I can't hear you. Oh no, I broke everything, everyone. I'm sorry.
Let me see if the headphones work.
Oh, now I hear you. Do you hear me? Can we all hear each other?
Now, yes.
Heard you. I heard you.
Okay, and I can hear you guys. All right, success, success,
Oh, the
success,
joy of
success.
Zoom.
In under 10 minutes. All right, that'll work. All right. All right, all right. So okay, Mr. Smelling, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna comment and say that I found it. I really thought it was interesting reading about Professor Mari Matsuda's
Mm.
perspective about the voice of color
Mhm.
and how the critiques against that, and yet the kind of like the counter critiques that she's argued against it, and it definitely sent me on a long tangential research binge, and it was interesting to read up on some of her more contemporary scholarship. So I just wanted to spike that out and say that that was an interesting like cross perspective as we're like figuring out the groundwork of the theories and all the different ways of looking at it.
It really is interesting. I'm glad you brought that up because again, where narrative is just such a big piece of critical race theory and how it originated and entrenched itself within law schools. And again, if critical race theory emanates from critical legal studies, like I just mentioned about this idea of hidden biases and ideas of power, controlling how the law actually is produced, then logic is not winning. That there has to be some other way to influence the law, and narrative becomes this very strong tool. But on the other hand, as Mary Matsuda and others have gone back and forth about, who is authorized to speak for Black people, who is authorized to speak for women, and what biases and that do they carry with them, what perspectives do they carry with them, and especially when it bleeds into today's class talking about intersectionality. Because for those, let's say, male writers, let's say a Derek Bell writing narratives in the 70s and the 80s, right? Intersectionality argues that his perspective is not necessarily representative of all of Black people because it comes from the patriarchy. It comes from a position of relative power, perhaps not absolute, probably not at the top, but this idea that that Black men, particularly those that were hired first within elite law schools, then entrench a perspective that is their own, that doesn't reflect, let's say, Black women. But then even further, uh, class in between Black men. Again, from those that have went to elite colleges or come from suburban or middle class households versus those that may have come from more modest households, North versus South. I mean, there's just all types of different ways in which people have come up and see the world. Again, we have a vice president who, for some, does not an issue to me, but for some people, it was an issue of what exactly is her ethnicity. Is she Black and African American? To some people, that mattered because they believe it influences her perspective, right? And so our discussion on intersectionality, I think, really heightens that discussion, or takes that discussion of the voice of color, in that authorization, um, genuineness, all of those things are really interesting to dive into. And I can't let it even go without, again, a last um, invocation of this somewhat new philosophical field within Black studies called Afro-pessimism, which argues that it's an extension of Derek Bell's racial realism, that really argues that anything good, right? It's pessimistic. So anything good happening within the law is actually just a tool of subordination. That is that positive aspects of the law or the Black Lives Matter movement or whatever the case may be, even if they have short-term benefits, that in the long term they're used to just pacify and promote the illusion of inclusion. If that is true, if that is cogent, then it even calls into question us as law professors. Like, why is the power structure paying us to why does the power structure value my voice instead of someone else's voice, unless it must be because my voice is somehow consistent or usable by the system, right? So this idea of the voice of color, and even just whether law professors writ large have the capacity to reflect what is really going on in race is really interesting, and especially when you're dealing with a legal system where the conservative side says, well, the whole point of the legal system is strictly to respect the individual and not the group in the first place, right? So that is a very interesting, so that idea of the voice of color, it may seem somewhat philosophical and not so much attached to the law, but the reason why it is a very important legal question is because the other side argues that perhaps we shouldn't recognize race at all, that we should only recognize individuals because there is no authority for any one person to speak for the race. And that's even before we get to the idea of, is there even a such thing as race, where we're going to talk about essential intersectionality versus anti-essentialism, right? And anti-essentialism, I think that's an interesting term she uses there, because 20 years ago, we would have called it post-racialism. The idea that we've just gotten beyond race. Great stuff. More questions. Glad to go backwards. Glad to go over that stuff, make things more clear, or maybe even more confusing. Who knows? Okay, I just wanted to note we did talk about Comcast versus National Association of African American Owned Media, the Byron Allen case, and how we can critique it, and how it chose the but-for test instead of the motivating factors test, how that's consistent with perhaps interconvergence theory. Well, I thought it was very interesting. Oh, having a little internet connection trouble. But I thought that was interesting. A current event just happened. I just saw it today. I didn't even get to pull up the documents, but I just read that there is a new lawsuit filed by a former baseball player. And I'm a baseball fan, but I really don't know this guy, who apparently took his wealth from playing baseball and invested in McDonald's franchises, owns 14 of them, and is now filed a lawsuit against McDonald's, somewhat similar to Byron Allen's lawsuit against Comcast. The difference being he already has a relationship with McDonald's, and so the lawsuit is factually about his ability to expand into lucrative areas or so-called white neighborhoods and whatnot, and McDonald's reluctance to allow him to do that. So it's very interesting to me about whether that's going to just follow the same track as the Byron Allen case, whether it's resolved by the standard in the Byron Allen case, or whether it's another legal issue or attack on that particular statute. Because again, Justice Ginsburg's concurrence was an attempt to leave open some space for others to kind of squeeze through. So I just wanted to put that out there. Okay, and so we left off talking about LatCrit. Because LatCrit itself is, on the one hand, an extension of critical race theory, so to speak, or perhaps a criticism of critical race theory that then now stands on its own. Professor Bridges, her book is very much into defining critical race theory, right? What is its content? What is its circle? What is its sphere? And whether or not these permutations fit within it or are outside of it. And that's very natural because, again, she is, at this point, probably the preeminent scholar in the country on it in the legal context. So again, so you would expect her to be very hyper vigilant about what is and what is not critical race theory. The interesting thing about that is that critical race theory itself has um, taking a lot of pride in being undefinable. So when I gave you that definition of anti-subordination law or anti-group subordination law, well, even that can get played with because we can talk about later. Well, what does that include? White men? Does that include a reverse racism if it's anti-group subordination in just a general term? Okay, so we're going to put that to the side. We'll return to those questions when we get to the end of this class, and we talk about class crits, LGBT crits, queer crits, APA crits, disc crits, DESI crits, all types of different critical race theorists that have plumed or bloomed out of the origins. But the first successful kind of extension was LatCrit. And I think today, or at least the trouble, the tragedies, the catastrophes going on in Texas right now, is a very good lead-in because we can ask whether or not not even just from a legal but from a social standpoint, whether or not our concern about this catastrophe is appropriate given who are the victims, right? We can, for those of us that go back to Hurricane Katrina, right? Um, it still didn't seem like there were people who really cared all that much until you saw very graphic images of people floating in the floodwaters, deceased, right? And even then, the response for a lot of people was lacking. And so I guess the question becomes, in this particular instance, and let me even say in Katrina, Louisiana has a very strong Hispanic Latino population. And yet I don't recall seeing stories or news reports or whatnot that featured Latino or Hispanic residents. And so I think the question I think we can deal with today, and again, it's ongoing, so there's no answer to it at the moment, is would there be more concern? Would there be more intervention? Would it even have happened in the first place if we were dealing with where the people that were the most vulnerable were not Hispanic or Latino, that had been othered? And when we're talking about Texas and southwestern states, I mean, we really are talking about otherness, right? This idea of us and them and a border in between the two. So this is, to me, is a very good introduction into, or unfortunately, the tragedy itself is a good lead-in to this discussion of LatCrit, right? How the law, either the way it's written by a legislature, the way it's executed by the government bureaucracy, or the way the law or cases are interpreted by the judiciary, does it follow a logical production? Does it follow the themes that we espouse when we talk about the Constitution? Or are they means, or is the law used as a tool to further subordination? And even beyond that, is it possible to use the law as a tool to combat subordination? I think between Katrina and COVID, I am an economics person, right? So we're going to get into some areas today and in the next couple weeks that deal with issues that I am less familiar with because of my educational or scholarly background. Number one, these are caveats I'm giving to you, and I'm hoping that they inspire you all to fill some of the gaps. Number two, again, I am also coming from the patriarchy, right? So as we talk about intersectionality, as we talk about gender discrimination, as we talk about LGBT rights, I am coming from a heteronormative position, right? And so those two factors, my position and perspective, and therefore internal biases, on top of my external biases, that I am a very concerned economic scholar that focus on material benefits instead of, let's say, personal dignity, right? Leaves me with blind spots, right? So in these discussions that are coming up, I'm hoping that I get some hands. I'm hoping that I get folks to 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 follow up on what. And let me say this: this last week has been very good. More than half of you have reached out about what your topics are going to be. Some are more detailed than others, but all of them are exciting, and I look very much forward to you guys teaching me about those particular subjects. Again, lawyering is teaching, right? So hopefully you're getting more comfortable with that. Hopefully you're getting more comfortable with the subject that you want to address for the project. I didn't see any emails that demanded a final exam, so I think that's great, right? Now, so as you get comfortable with your topics, hopefully you also get even more comfortable with, in this particular class, putting yourself out there or putting it out there, or whatever the case may be. So I say all that to say that because I come from an economic perspective, I have some certain pre-programmed answers to questions like the one below. Like, what is the point of racism, right? How does it benefit racists to be racist, right? How does it benefit the wealthy to abuse the poor and other subordinated groups? Like, I think that's something of an important question, legally speaking, right? Because socially, on Facebook and other places, right, there's a lot of, other people are just evil, right? The other side is just has it wrong. Whereas lawyers, again, that are anticipating writing appellate briefs, that are anticipating writing white papers and yellow papers and other types of studies for congressional committees, for administrative agencies, right? The key for, as lawyers, what makes us different is having to address the other side's argument as well as they can present it, right? And so, and yes, now, of course, I'm doing it in a competitive way. So I'm presenting your argument so I can smash it, right? But I have to know where, and I might even assign some things to the other side that they might not even agree with. But I need to know, kind of within the law, what are those terminologies that we can use other than evil or even fascist. I think we need at least three syllables. Fascist only has 2 syllables, right? So in legal argument, right, you have to say, you can't call somebody a liar. They are discreditable, right? We need at least 3 syllables to be polite in the law, right? So, so on the one hand, individual liberty, right? When you're talking about the idea of wealthy people not feeling as though they have to help poor people, right? There was there was a mayor of a small town in Texas that came out. I mean, he came out hard with the social Darwinism. There was he's already been fired, or he already resigned by noon. The letter went viral. I'm paraphrasing, but it was just, this is all the fault of socialism. Everybody you're either strong or you're weak. Those who have ingenuity will get through this. Those who don't will perish, and it's your own fault. It was astounding, honestly, because the verbiage was not that far off of what I just spoke. And again, so these folks aren't using Judge Posner's words. They're not lunatics, right? This person actually has an elected office. He's at least intelligent enough to have won an election. As we see from the riots, the insurrection at the Capitol, that very intelligent or wealthy people are still backing senators and other representatives, even when they aren't doing what most people think is consistent with the law, right? So this idea that I don't have to care about other people, right? On the one hand, we can call this idea of individual liberty. We could also add another word. I should have put it in there next to it, called public choice, which is really an odd word to describe it. It's an economic word that is not just about individual liberty. It's also public choice theory in the law. The theorist that came up with it, or people credited to, is an economist named James Buchanan. But this idea of public choice theory is that we're not all in this together, that most of law study has analyzed the law as if, again, we are just one nation. What is the best for the entire nation, considering the melting pot of groups that are within it? Public choice theory is the conservative kind of side of intersectionality and critical race theory, where public choice theory says, no, we're not all in this together. That even going all the way back to James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, there was a concern for factions, right? That certain groups of people within a country just use their money and their time, their energy, and their resources to capture rules, laws, legislation, almost like goods and services, right? That if I want to buy a car because it's good for me, I buy legislation, or I buy a senator because it's good for me, right? And this idea of public choice theory, of course, reflects the idea that each group is kind of responsible on its own to secure law, rules, regulation, and all that in its own favor, rather than looking out for the whole country as a whole, right? So on the one hand, individual liberty, I'm all for myself. On the other hand, public choice theory, whatever group I am belong to is responsible for fighting for its own benefits without regard to the health or wealth of the country or other particular groups. We could turn that up a notch. We could take this all the way back 100 years or maybe 150 years. You don't hear the name Charles Darwin anymore. It was a more popular name, and Darwinism was more popular when I was younger in the 20th century, that there were still people that outwardly argued that the weak will, the strong survive, the weak perish, and that's just how life goes. So this idea of social Darwinism comes from, again, the natural world. And we don't hear, again, a lot about natural law anymore. In the 20th century, natural law was behind this argument that everyone is on their own. We don't have to look out for particular groups because nature does it, right? Social Darwinism led to a group of politics called eugenicists. Right? Has anybody heard of eugenics? Okay, so eugenics, of course, is related to social Darwinism in the idea that all humans are not created equal, right? That is a slogan, that is a theme of the U.S. Constitution, but that does not require everybody in the United States to operate that way, including legal actors and scholars or what have you. That some that believe in social Darwinism or eugenics, and I talked about Richard Posner, and we were talking about why he is so adamant and has so much anger against critical race theory, and I'm not going to say he's never publicly espoused Darwinism or eugenicism. However, his theories seem to suggest he does in fact believe that other so-called third world peoples are catching up, right? When we hold the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, um, um, Western philosophy as the preeminent and also the first, right? To argue that Western philosophy and Enlightenment is the first to arrive at logic. If you accept that for true, then it seems quite natural to assume that the rest of the world is just intellectually catching up. So this idea of social Darwinism, eugenicism, Western supremacy or white supremacy can be derived from a lot of our scholarly accolades, right? From the way we teach world civilization in elementary school or even high school, when we say that logic came from, let's say, Socrates, instead of the fact that Socrates may have written about is the oldest writings about logic that may have survived, right? But or that I'm sorry, because it's hard to run countries that existed prior to the Greeks without logic. Um, so I think I spent a lot of time on this why question, right? We're going to return to this why question when we talk about class crits, when we talk about whether or not race and class is distinct or is it mutually constitutive, because class crits argue that race and class are opposite sides of the very same coin, in the idea that the reason why we have all these issues, the reason why we have Katrina, the asymmetrical response to COVID, the tragedy in Dallas this weekend or whatever, is because is the argument that wealth as a class, the aristocracy as a class, needs race to control poor white people and needs poor white people to control race, right? That mutual distraction, that one can't do without the other, right? That the whole purpose of recognizing race is to use race as a means of controlling the white poor. And that the only reason you have a white poor is so you can use their manpower or people power or labor to go around the world and subordinate the rest of all the others that are outside of the Western epistemology or whatever. So class crits argue that race and class have no purpose outside of each other, which is really interesting. So we're going to talk about that when we get to the extension of all these critical theories and how they expand from each other, but also how they overlap with one another. Questions, concerns, comments? All right. I mentioned we really quickly last week. I mentioned about the birth and the chronology of LatCrit. Again, I like to draw that parallel or analogy between critical race theory and hip hop. Again, having originated in the 70s, found its form in the 80s, then expanded in the 90s. And we talked about a couple. I'm so glad that you guys got my 90s references. That made me bold enough to even take it back to the 80s. For those that may remember the New York City Breakers, Rocksteady crew. I'm from Philadelphia, so we had a crew called the Tough Crew, who were a bunch of Hispanic brothers from North Philly. And then my favorite hip hop movie of all time is called Beat Street. Has anybody? A lot of people have heard of Breaking. Please tell me there's at least one person that remembers Beat Street. No? All right. Well, then you don't remember my man Ramo, the lead character. Anyway, there was a very heavy, again, in all those movies, Beat Street, Breaking. These were movies that were created about hip hop and breakdancing before 1985, and it's very strong Hispanic Latino presence in those movies because it was also reflected in the genre before it kind of took on a black-white paradigm. Also, there's a movie from the late 70s that's similar. Also, I don't know if you guys remember The Warriors. Also an urban, yes, yes, indeed, come out to play, yay, right? An urban fiction that was intentionally trying to be. I had called it Star Trek socialism back in like our very first class, but again, this kind of surreal society that was again anti-racist, or that was a true melting pot or whatever. So um, this time right now is very interesting to me because there was this window of time back in like the late 70s, early 80s, where there was a popular culture seemed to try to embrace this multiculturalism. White R&B singers were hot on black radio in the early 80s. Kenny Loggins, Michael McDonald, um, 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 Tina Marie. I mean, it was a lot. So it's really interesting to see, for me, to see 40 years later, 30 years later, how durable this anti-racism movement will be. Anyway, back to LatCrit. Some of the very early scholars, and I know some of you that are on that are here are identified that LatCrit issues are what you will be, or what you will be presenting or teaching me about as far as our project. So I definitely want to make sure that we at least identify some scholars that you could be interested in, that you could even just look up. And again, one of the great things about finding a scholar that speaks to you is, or at least that writes on an issue that speaks to you, is not just their paper, but their footnotes. Their footnotes are a pain in the butt. But the great thing for the reader is, again, I am doing a lot of the research for you. So if you like me as a scholar, I'm telling you who I like, right? In the footnotes, I'm telling you who I learned from and I think is important when I put them all up in the footnotes. And so when I go through my own, when I go through scholarship and I find a paper that's interesting, it's almost just as interesting to me to go into the footnotes and see the stuff that those folks wrote. So the Derek Bell, the Kimberly Crenshaw of LatCrit could possibly be Richard Delgado. He has a critical race theory case book. We could have used his book in this particular class. I chose Professor Bridges' book because it's more up to date. I think it is more consistent with where progressive ideology is right now. But Richard Delgado is a very, very prominent critical race theorist. And one of the interesting things about Richard Delgado is later in his career, all of his papers are Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic, right? Which was a really early convention where he made sure to co-author his partner, right? To argue that he could not have produced the scholarship that he produced, and he produced a ton of, I mean, tons of it. I mean, binders, books full of scholarship, that he could not do what he has done without his partner. And therefore, I don't know when he started doing it, but in all of his later scholarship, all of his authorships are Richard Delgado and Gene Stefancic. Gene Stefancic is also a professor, so she is also published as well. So they move. So how much of it is as a unit versus individual? Whether they want you to see them as a unit versus individuals. Really interesting stuff. Really interesting stuff when you go outside of the norms, right? Margaret Montoya, Tanya Hernandez, Francisco Valdez. We're going to talk about Frank Valdez later when we talk about queer crit or LGBT crit. And again, that intersectionality within LatCrit, right? To be Latino, but then also to be gay and Latino, right? So, and I'm even going to talk a little later about a colleague of mine when I taught at Florida International, Jose Gabilondo, who has a lot of different identities that you could call subordinated, from Cuban to gay to well, we'll get to Jose in a second. Berta Hernandez, Ian Haney Lopez had a great book out maybe 3 years ago called Dog Whistle Politics. Juan Perea is a scholar that I really like about, again, economic issues. He talks about, he has a great paper about economic exclusion during the New Deal in the 20s, economic exclusion through the GI Bill in the 50s and the 60s, the ways in which the racial wealth gap was expanded by the law, even with programs that we thought were progressive. That we can describe some progressive programs as so-called Herrenvolk socialism, or socialism only for the highest class, right? Um, it's very akin to what some people may even call corporate socialism, but it has more of a racial component. Carmen Gonzalez does a lot of work with U.S. policy in Latin America. Stephen Ramirez, fantastic paper on law and economics. I've mentioned Edilberto Roman, who deals with a lot of issues, not just with Puerto Rico, but he does, but his scholarship deals with U.S. possessions, right? This idea, we forget that the United States is an empire still in the classic sense of the word, to the extent it quote unquote owns the Mariana Islands, Guam, Puerto Rico, where these people are American, but not. I forgot what island it was. I had a tax case on there, and their tax code is mandated to be the U.S. tax code, just with West Papua's name wherever the U.S. was. And it happened to cause some problems textually because some people tried to just get out of paying their taxes because they were like, no, we don't have to pay attention to the IRS. The only service that can come after us is the Guam service, or whatever the case may be. Anyway, again, this idea of U.S. possessions, not just in the Caribbean, but also in the Pacific Ocean, is a very huge issue. Guadalupe Luna, oh my gosh, she taught me so much about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. So again, we can talk about Puerto Rico, we can talk about Cuba, we can talk about Mexico, right? The idea that the land, when the Spanish-American War was resolved, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo said that Mexican nationals who own property in California, Nevada, etc., still own that property, that their title was good to owning that property. They just had to change their flags. The borders changed, but the ownership didn't change according to the treaty. However, the operation of law was different, right? The operation of law, their treaty, whenever a homesteader took their land and forced them to prove that they owned it, their titles were never good enough. Many of their titles were destroyed by fire, by sabotage, or even just by the fact that it was a formerly Mexican title, and because they lost the war, those records had been lost. And so within, I forget how many years, almost not one Mexican national owned property in the state of California, even though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was supposed to guarantee them continued ownership without interference after the war was over. So again, an issue of where the law says one thing, but it responds to power and race in its actual operation. Now I got to bring up something controversial, which was really interesting when she presented. One of the conservative professors asked Professor Luna, said, well, even though the Americans or the white people took it from the Mexicans, isn't it true that the Mexicans took it from the Native Americans? So don't you have a continuation of justice problem? I got to admit, at this time, I was very young in the law and I was pretty ignorant about this. And it was the first time I had heard anyone draw distinctions between Native Americans, Hispanics, and Latinos, right? Her answer was, yes, that is problematic, right? Number one, separating Native Americans from Mexican peoples, right? And is that correct, right? And then if you're separating Mexico from those people, those who are indigenous to the Americas, then that draws in that question that's not often asked, but what is the difference between Latino or Latina and Hispanic? And I'm going to ask, I'm going to put it out there. This is dangerous, but again, I'm going to put it out there. Is there something wrong with this statement? Is there something wrong with this statement? And this is an invitation for criticism. Latino suggests being people that have been subjugated by, and the evidence of that subjugation is language. Have they been subordinated and a culture foisted upon them? Versus Hispanic, that is a belief in an ancestral link to Spain. A distinction between Hispanic and Latino, where Hispanic denotes or connotes a link, an ancestral link to Spain, versus Latino or Latinx or Latina that suggests or connotes a connection to indigenous America with a Spanish culture foisted upon. Does that make any sense? Is that something to criticize? Is that something subordinating? Is there a better definition, a better distinction? Is it a false distinction entirely? Ms. Delval, please.
So the way that I've always thought of it is Hispanic ties to language, while Latina refers to ethnicity. So when defining whether or not you're Hispanic or Latina, I have friends who are from Spain who are Hispanic, but they're not Latina. I would identify, when defining myself and my identity, I'm both Hispanic and Latina, but I will always describe myself first as Latina because that defines my culture and my ethnicity and not just solely my language.
And I didn't mean to identify language as the sole identifier or element of culture, but great answer. I appreciate your answer for sure. More others? Because I think that even your answer, it's very interesting and somewhat consistent with, again, what I inartfully put out there. Because again, there is never, I don't think I've ever heard the term Afro-Hispanic, where I have often heard Afro-Latina. Right. And then we can also, I'm so glad there was, we didn't rehash the controversy over Jennifer Lopez and a couple of decades ago about whether she's allowed to say the N-word because she's from the Bronx and Puerto Rico. I mean, to me, it was a facet. If you were around at that time, it was a very fascinating issue if you are very serious about whether or not race exists and the contours of it. And it has and there's legal consequences for this, because when we talk about Latino, Hispanic, and the law, what category are we suing under, right? What categories offer in civil rights laws? Civil rights law protect against racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination, perhaps, national origin. And so being able to utilize the categories that are available requires us to actually think seriously about these things that often are very uncomfortable. Ms. Delval Torres.
Yeah, I was actually thinking a lot about that when I was doing the reading, especially when it comes to Black-white paradigm in critical race theory, and about how LatCrit has criticized that paradigm and how it's tricky. And I've struggled with this myself, especially lately, of exactly like what you said, like what category do I fall under? Because I am white or white passing, or however we are to define that. Like, I very clearly benefit from white privilege, but also have suffered from some sort of discrimination or prejudice from like white Americans. And where do I fall in this category? But I do think, in regards to the reading about how LatCrit is critical of Black-white paradigms, I also don't think that that LatCrit should eliminate or should be overly critical of the Black-white paradigm, because there is a significant mistreatment of Black and darker skinned Latinos within Latina communities. So it feels ignorant for me to say that we should eliminate this paradigm when it is incredibly critical in understanding culturally Latina relations, because in Puerto Rico specifically, where there's such a drastic variety in skin tones, like there is a lot more racism and prejudice to Afro-Boricuas or darker skinned Boricuas than there are to people like me who are light skinned Boricuas or white. Yeah. So I think those two things kind of coexist within themselves, and just Latinos in general just kind of fall into this weird mess of categories of we don't really know how to identify.
Excellent point. And that is one of the problems, not just with Latino or Latina, but Black and white, that racial categories fall apart. When we say that they don't work or they fall apart, is because they're at the very same time, they're over inclusive and under inclusive at the very same time, right? And I very much appreciate what you're describing about what some people call colorism, right? That instead of racism, perhaps in a global context, we may describe colorism, in that, for example, Brazil sold itself as a racial, as a rainbow country, as a racial paradise for years, until again the faces at the bottom of the well kept saying, no, it's just not like that. It may not follow the Black-white paradigm, right? That someone such as myself, whether I would be Black or Moreno or whatnot, there are several different categories within the Brazilian hierarchy. And then if we apply this to, again, we're going to talk about Asian Pacific Americans in the law and globalism in the Eastern Hemisphere, where again, this idea of race in the Black and white paradigm falls apart, and yet also respects the hierarchy, because colorism seems to suggest, if we eliminated if we stopped saying racism and went to colorism, my critique of that, it seems to suggest that sometimes white is at the top and sometimes Black is at the bottom, but sometimes Black is at the top, sometimes white is at the bottom. When colorism globally seems to be still white at the top, and then differentiate or a hierarchy based on distance from Lucy, right? Our original African ancestor, right? The further away, and again, this goes back to social Darwinism and eugenics, the idea that our original African ancestor to all of us was primitive, and that the further we get away from there comes so-called intelligence or civilization or whatever the case may be, right? Great comments and points. So there's some great, for those that haven't looked, there's some great issues in the chat room. It's an extremely rich area to talk about. I just want to say, and as a matter of fact, I'm even going to put a story in there. I'm hopefully only take about 2 minutes, but my second job, my first job was at Penn State Dickinson, but that was only as a visiting professor. And then I finally got hired as a tenure track professor at Florida International College of Law down in Miami. I had never even been to Miami. I had been to lots of places and whatnot, so I thought I was pretty experienced, but I'd never been to Miami. And I understood that was going to be a different cultural experience. And so I had never heard of Florida International. And then as soon as I get there, I learned that Florida International University is almost 3 or 4 times bigger than the University of Miami, right? It's huge. It's actually Florida State at Miami. And even that description, the fact that they won't call it Florida State and they call it Florida International instead, to kind of distinguish it from the University of Florida and Florida State and whatnot, said a lot. So this was my first opportunity to work at a so-called historically Hispanic college and university, which was very enlightening for me. It's in southwestern Miami, where you can get along very well speaking Spanish and no English. But if you speak English and no Spanish, it can be kind of difficult to get some bacon and eggs if you're late for class, right? Just a very, very rich cultural experience. And one of the interesting things about it, the law school was only 2 years old when I got there. So it didn't even have its first graduating class. So I was not a founding member, but I did get there 2 years into the game. And there was a fight. I walked into a brawl, a intellectual brawl over the future of the law school. Was it going to hire scholars that would get it into the top 100, that would do formal law school teaching, law and economics, textualism, etc.? Or would it be a bastion of critical theory, as some of the initial hires were Charles Pouncey, Jorge Escaro, Jose Gabilondo, and whether or not they could, quote unquote, capture a legal institution to push towards a progressive or critical agenda, similar or in response to schools like the University of Chicago, which is avowedly a law and economics institution. George Mason, which is avowedly a law and economics institution. I believe Chapman Law School on the West Coast is an avowedly conservative institution. Ave Maria is an avowedly religious legal institution. So I walked in in the midst of a brouhaha about the direction of the school, where if you were on this ideological side, your tenure might get scuttled or your hiring may get rejected or whatnot because you did not think the right way or did not fit in the right camps. So when we talk about those original discussions, those critiques of critical race theory, when we talk about those origins of critical race theory, when I got in the Legal Academy in 2004, that fight was in full fire about what counted as legal scholarship and who should get a job and keep a job and get tenure based on what they were writing. I hope, or it seems, that 15 years later, critical race theory is much more accepted on the one hand. On the other hand, I can also report that narrative seems to be on the wane, that those of us that do critical race theory seem to have, I don't want to call it falling in the trap, but fallen into conventional law scholarship writing, for good or for bad, I talk about institutions. Frank Valdez, I remember he scolded and as a matter of fact, that very first year I'm at FIU College of Law, they hosted LatCrit. And the lead organizer was Charles Pouncey, who is a very tall, salt and peppered beard, dark-skinned black man of the LGBT community. And so as someone who had just been introduced to the academy, who had barely even a handle on what critical race theory was, to be introduced to LatCrit and delved in the middle of it was a very exciting time. LatCrit has also expanded beyond the legal field, just like critical race theory has. So I just wanted to point out a couple of theorists that I just happen to appreciate outside of law schools. Edward Bonilla Silva has a fantastic book. I think he's president of the American Sociological Association. If he's not now, he was very not too long ago. And he has an extremely influential book called Racism Without Racists, right? How do we have these racialized structures? How do we have systemic bias when there are so many people committed, or at least expressively committed towards ending racism? But perhaps what are the code words? What are the pretexts that are used to hide racism? And then another scholar, Stephen Garcia, who's in the economics. I think he's not, he's at the Center for the Study of Group Dynamics at the University of Michigan. And I'm going to bring him up later in the course when we talk about the construction of race, when we talk about white privilege, when we talk about microaggressions. His contribution is the argument, and it's helpful to intersectionality, is that no matter what group you belong to, you tend to privilege those within your cipher against those that are outside of it. That's just the idea that birds of a feather flock together as just a natural dynamic. Some do it more than others, some have more cohesion than others, some have more group loyalty than others, but he found ways to try to measure it statistically. One of the ways was this. People were asked, I will offer you $5 and everybody in your group gets $5. Everybody outside of your group gets $5. Everybody gets $5. Total equality. You can choose that. That's A. That's choice A. Choice B, you get $10. You get double what you would have had. But the people in your group still only get 5. The people outside your group get 10. So we're talking economics, we're talking rationality, right? More is better than less. I get 10 instead of 5. And I'm an individual, right? I'm supposed to be an individual. So the choice A is rational, that I take 10 over the $5. And yet, whether your group is black, white, Hispanic, Asian, man, woman, foreign, domestic, short, tall, if you self-ascribe to a group, the majority of that group takes $5 instead of $10. The majority of that group chooses A instead of B. The majority of that group chooses not to sell out their group, even though it is financially beneficial to them. It's never 100% of all the participants, right? And we probably could, and the numbers probably would vary if you made it $20 or $100. Right? So there's lots of experimentation, but just this idea that you could statistically show that people care about their in groups versus their out groups supports perhaps Derek Bell's racial realisms, perhaps supports Michelle Alexander and Afro-pessimism, the idea that that racism is perhaps permanent, right? And that our approaches should be different. Ms. Carroll, for sure.
How does the concept that you just mentioned correlate with public choice theory, or are they similar?
It's consistent it is somewhat inconsistent with the individual liberty. It is more consistent with public choice theory in the idea that groups and factions fight to win their own legislation and regulation, just as a lobbying group for the record industry. So the idea that, yes, so Stephen Garcia's experiment is very consistent with public choice theory in the idea that white people, black people, or any intersection of any group will contribute, invest in activities that don't necessarily benefit me individually, but benefit my group, right? And so this idea, and especially as against those outside, because public choice theory is contrasted with so-called civic republicanism. Civic republicanism is, again, this theory that each of us as individuals cares about all of America, that we're all, again, Martin Luther King would be looked at as a civic republicanism, that his description of America was about everyone getting along, not just black people. Malcolm X could probably be looked at as the public choice theorist, right? Where no, this is for my group. I will die for my group. My individual benefit may not be as high as others, but my concern for the group is higher than it is for those outside of the group. And that's more consistent with public choice theory. Great question. Great stuff. Yeah. Public choice theory and all that stuff, the idea of self or group interest leads us to this idea of institutions, right? What institutions are being created to then lobby, right? And so LatCrit, more than just an offshoot of CRT, LatCrit is an organization. It is its own, it is a 501c3. They have a scholarship conference every so often, right? And again, look at the board of directors of LatCrit.org, and you will see a rainbow coalition, right? You will see it was not necessarily led by Latino or Hispanic or Latinx scholars, right? Very broad array. And again, that's also what leads me to call critical race theory just anti-group subordination. Because if you go to the conferences, right, you're not kicked out of the conferences because your paper doesn't fit some mold or some essential definition of critical race theory or LatCrit. And so when you go to a LatCrit conference, when you go to a critical race theory conference, you will just see papers abound about anti-law and anti-subordination of just almost every conceivable group, including, let's say, orphans or it's as broad as possible. Oh, thank you very much for posting in the chat room the link to. There's not just LatCrit.org. There's Berkeley La Raza Law Journal. I believe there's other journals that deal with Hispanic and Latino issues, but there's also you can find a lot of LatCrit scholarship in international human rights journals, right? Especially when you're dealing with issues that are dealing with the United States relation to Latin America. We need to start flying. All right, we talked about the essentialism. One of the issues about LatCrit, again, same thing with race. What does it mean specifically? We just talked about that because it's very important legally to fit into a particular category when using US law to sue. Am I suing for race discrimination? Am I suing for discrimination based on national origin? Does the statute even recognize ethnic discrimination, and what does that mean? And we're going to deal with a lot of this again when we talk about intersectionality and anti-essentialism, because on the one hand, sociologists or others, some people believe that to define race, to even define gender, to define these things is to subordinate those who do not fit the mold, right? So if we give a race a definition, discrimination, you got to eat hot sauce in order to be black. Well, I don't eat hot sauce, right? I'm less than black because I don't get down with hot sauce. So, right. So and what happens when the law does it? It's not even just my people, but the United States decides, the United States court system decides what black is, what Latino is, what Hispanic is. And if I don't fit that mold, I am legally, not just socially, but legally on the outside, right? So anyway, those are really interesting issues. So LatCrit issues, again, and I know there's some people that want to write on these issues that haven't decided specifically. I mean, there is, I wish we had more time next week or one of these following weeks. What I'd really like to do is take you guys on a really quick trip through Westlaw's secondary sources and just go throw in the search engine race or LatCrit or Latino or Latinx or Latina, and just let the results wash over you, right? Or then just put in another term in there to shorten it up and just scroll through the titles, right? I guarantee you, you will be impressed in a very literal sense about the different topics and how much stuff is out there that scholars have dealt with, dealing with particular issues, from because there's just so many for us to name. I mean, we can talk about violence and discrimination as far as hate crimes. We can talk about discrimination in the employment text, the commercial context. Again, when we're talking about COVID, when we're talking about um, um, Dallas, Texas, we're talking about Katrina, we're also talking about the administrative disparate treatment. We often talk about legislatures, we often talk about judiciary, but racism within the executive branches of the federal government, state and local governments, about how they apply discretion in government services is not talked about nearly enough in my view. Again, immigration issues, globalization, and again, this sense of United States and empire. And I really think this is really interesting because a lot of critical scholars criticize United States foreign policy and empire, and that puts them at odds and easy to criticize as anti-American, right? That if you're pro-American, then to hell with these other countries. They're not, again, going back to the Stephen Garcia, are you American enough, right? Will you sacrifice perhaps your own moral senses to increase the wealth of the country? Do we even recognize that our standard of living perhaps is based on the subjugation of the rest of the world? I know there's a lot of progressive people that point to the 50s and the 60s and say, wow, back in the 50s and the 60s, a person on minimum wage or one worker household could support a whole family and whatnot. And this is true, but it begs the question whether in the 50s and 60s, the reason that was possible was because the US dollar was very strong, because the US was an empire that had a stronger grip on the rest of the world, the so-called third world, right? If we're pining for that type of lifestyle, are we asking for the US to reassert itself over the rest of the world to get it? Anyway, more policing issues. Again, when we deal with the black-white paradigm, when it comes to Black Lives Matter, right? We can make a very strong argument about how it makes Latino, Hispanic issues with policing invisible and unaddressed, perhaps. Or does a rising tide lift all boats? Does Black Lives Matter increase the sensitivity writ large? I don't know. I think they're interesting questions. And what about positive rights? Right, all the things that we talked about before is what negative rights are, what the government should not do to people. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution is one by one what the government cannot do, right? It's not supposed to deprive you of your property. It's not supposed to pass laws against free speech. It's all about what it's not supposed to do. There are very few positive rights in the US Constitution. There are very few things that the United States is forced to do because the Constitution demands it. It's forced to have a treasury. It's forced to have a post office. But after that, what is it required to do? It's actually required to have copyright law, one of the very few positive rights. But what is not there? There is not a positive right to education, right? There is not a positive constitutional right to health or housing or welfare, right? And so, again, as far as the quote unquote faces at the bottom of the well, is this an issue for just class crits, or is it a disproportional, or is the disproportionate effect on Black people or people of color make it a critical race issue? Inclusion, again, like language and cultural recognition. And I'm sure I missed a ton. Again, if we went through, hopefully we get a chance to go through Westlaw and perhaps go through a search and see that there's just so many different issues that can be discussed about law and subordination as far as Latino, Hispanic populations. Um, I think we dealt with that enough. So let's bridge that into what we're calling big tent CRT. So from critical race theory in the black-white paradigm to LatCrit in the 90s. And at the same time, although an organization wasn't created, there were Asian and Pacific American scholars from the beginning, right? From the beginning, Neil Gatunda, from Robert Chang, Sumi Cho, um, there have been those from the beginning talking about, again, this idea of a distinctive voice and this perhaps a distinctive Asian voice. But again, if we open up big tent critical race theory and keep using that word race, it begs a lot of questions, right? This idea of essentialism with race really starts to get perhaps intellectually uncomfortable when we talk about Asians as a race, right? Again, now you could, for those that are familiar with how broad Africa is, you could make the same arguments as far as the distinction between East Africans, South Africans, West Africans, African Americans, and whatnot. But I think I do think it is qualitatively or at least quantitatively different and heighten that distinction with Asians, or at least from our public perception of East Asia, right? I think many people naturally think of, when we talk about Asians in the law, automatically think East Asia, right? Whereas when we talk about Islam or Arabs or whatnot, that's actually Western Asia, right? And so the people of Palestine, Syria, Iraq, Iran, right? Are they qualitative or quantitatively different in culture or in treatment, right? Are they treated differently than Eastern Asians? Again, this idea of race essentialism really is challenged when we bring the whole rest of the world into our American or Western black-white paradigm. So East, we'll talk about issues related to China, Japan, and Korea. They seem to be lumped together a lot. And then we have a bunch of scholars that seem to coalesce together with Islamophobia and other issues with regard to immigration, international human rights or United States human rights. When after 9/11, there was a big issue, right, about Guantanamo Bay, U.S. jurisdiction, the rights to sue, who are the people of the United States, who is an enemy combatant, what does that even mean, where, right? So another category that just got invented at the time. Sahar Aziz, Mahmoud Tayyub, there's a lot of scholars that are dealing with these particular issues. And if there's anybody, again, that's contemplating dealing with any of those issues as far as our project, please, it's an issue. These are issues that I would love to learn much, much more about, right? And then perhaps some of the newest scholarship in critical race theory deals with South Asians. There had been a dearth, there had been missing in law academies law scholars that represented Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, right? And again, the idea that perhaps that this section of Asia is culturally or legally or treated different or seen different than others. And so Vinny Harpalani, where is Vinny right now? Is he in somewhere in South Carolina? Shit. Vinny Harpalani does a really good piece on affirmative action and race in South Asians. And especially intersectionality of the two. He considers himself Black and South Asian, right? So on the one hand, there's the idea of South Asian as its own race. On the other hand, there's the intersectionality of being perhaps Black and South Asian, Black and Muslim, Black and Japanese. As a matter of fact, was it 10 o'clock? Osaka versus Serena Williams is at 10 for anybody that's waiting for this to be over so they can really get into their evening. I think there's and I just want to also, the hottest book in 2020, in my mind, Afro-Pessimism, I think was 2019, but even if it was in 2020, the hottest book to me is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, as an attempt to describe the racial instances here, to go from slavery to Jim Crow apartheid to what are we now, where it's better than slavery, that it's perhaps better than Jim Crow, but it's still racialized. Does the caste system of economic or cultural development apply to the United States? And she does a pretty good job. Now, I know a lot of scholars, she's more of a journalist and then professor, and I know a lot of scholars have criticized maybe some of her treatment of caste as it appeared in India. Some have criticized that even as Black folks, that she did not examine caste as it existed in ancient Egypt, which some argue is the origination of the political system. Regardless, I think you can, if you can call present day incarceration modern day slavery and the fight against abolition, and that analogy works, then I think the analogy to caste also works. And I think you can go to almost any restaurant, highfalutin restaurant in the United States of America, and see caste at work, right? Who is going to be greeting you at the door? Who's going to be serving you the food? Who's going to be in the back in the kitchen, and who's going to be cleaning up? You can almost guess it before you walk in, right? So it may not be as hard or rigid caste as others, and it may not be as generational. However, is that the purpose of the racial wealth gap? Is the purpose of the racial wealth gap to eventually entrench people into a particular group that has only these certain occupational opportunities available to them, right? And there are arguments that there are people that will argue that, again, the way the untouchables are treated in India is worse than Black people in the United States of America. Now, again, is probably not allowed to be gained by the whose blues are iller than the other. However, but the idea that race in America, that we can't learn anything from the rest of the world, that race only exists in America, is challenged by the treatment of certain castes in India. I'm sorry, there's some, all right. I'm just loving your comments. I'm learning how to talk and try to check the chat at the same time. All right. I think one of the things we can do, if we have time, see, so we're going to be pushing intersectionality to next week, because I see there's almost no way we can give Kimberly Crenshaw her just due by 9:50. So for those that were dying to start talking about the Queen, and I mean that sincerely, I hope I don't disappoint you, and hope we definitely talk about her in much greater detail next week. But I do want to finish this. So again, going beyond the black and white paradigm, it's a very interesting traipse through legal history to talk about Asian exclusion from the United States, right? It's the black-white paradigm. We often talk about exclusion, the 3/5 clause, to Dred Scott, to Civil War, to Jim Crow, Civil Rights era, to the 80s, 90s, and now Black Lives Matter, right? This kind of chronological lineal order of blackness and subordination. And I'm going to actually go through that later to talk about how we have the racial wealth gap still existing from slavery and justification for reparations. But for today, it's to me that much more interesting that we can also draw that same line. We just don't often do it. Popular discourse just doesn't often draw the line between racial exclusion and Asian Americans since the Constitution, right? So we have the 1790 Naturalization Act, and I think that's listed in Kiara Bridges' book about how from the very beginning, right? Again, the Constitution is 1787, right? 1786, we have Articles of Confederation. 1787, we have the Constitution as we somewhat know it now. And 3 years within that, we have the Naturalization Act, which specifically excludes non-white persons from being naturalized as citizens. So not just black folks, but also Asians as well. Now, it's not a lot of Asian people at the time, and because remember, we're only a sliver of the East Coast. There's no Georgia, there's no Mississippi at this point yet. But at the same time, Asia, China, and all that are known places, right? We can fast forward that to the invitation, but the exclusion of Chinese from the California gold rush. So the expansion of the West. And when we talk about also blacks, that's also an exclusion from the California gold rush that's not talked about when we talk about the racial wealth gap as far as black folks. There was a brother, Mifflin Wister Gibbs, who travels all the way from Philadelphia to California, sets up a black newspaper in San Francisco. He's not a miner, but he does he owns businesses that support the mining. And then all of a sudden, the legislature of California in the 1850s writes a law that strips almost every right of citizenship from non-white persons. One of the most important being that you are not allowed to testify in court. Why is that important? Why is that subordinating? What is the harm that can come to you if you are not allowed to testify in court? Violence, right? That anybody, that a white person or mine or whatever can just take your land, they can abuse you physically, kill you, whatever, and the only person that can testify against them is another white person, right? And so Mifflin Wister Gibbs picked up and led 600 black miners out of California and pretty much established Vancouver, British Columbia. Interesting stuff. Interesting stuff. Meanwhile, again, we're talking about you can find lots of movies, you can find lots of popular discourse that talks about not just the Chinese and their subordination, but the idea that they were wantonly killed. I mean, just from Native Americans to China or whatever. Again, the black-white paradigm just does not speak to the whole of the racial horror that we've experienced in America. Moving forward, again, we have the Dred Scott, that even if they wanted to, a state could not make you a citizen. To the extent it wanted to consider Dred Scott and his wife to be citizens. I'm trying to remember if it was Missouri or Illinois. I know it was a dispute. They were going between Missouri and Illinois. And Illinois made them citizens, but the government, they could not avail themselves of the federal courts because the federal court said, well, even if a state considers you a citizen, you are not one of the people of the United States as the Constitution recognizes, right? And the interesting thing about that is once we correct that, once we say Dred Scott is wrong in principle, that a state can create a person and that the US federal government must recognize it, leads us to Citizens United, where a corporation being a person recognized by the state has to now be recognized by the federal government and given the Bill of Rights. That's an interesting play, right? That is an interesting, for some people, very sad play that the rationale of Dred Scott, or at least that it was turned on its head. That if a state can create a person, as far as black people are concerned, then it can create a person as far as a corporation is concerned and instill them with the same rights. It's a, right. So, but the question here, as we're talking right here, is its extension to other people, that it just doesn't apply to black folks. Now, the 13th and 15th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendment comes along, and the 1870 Naturalization Act applies to black people, but not to anyone else, right? And so we also see the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. So no matter how much you as a Chinese American worked in California and the West Coast during the gold rush, during the founding, I mean, and we're talking about a founding era for that part of America where wealth is being created, where lands are being distributed through the Homestead Act, acres are being given out and developed, that the Chinese are and other Asians are excluded entirely, right, by law. And I forgot to mention, again, we talked about in the Byron Allen case that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 already establishes that those that are operating, those minorities that can operate within the United States do have to be given the right to contract as white citizens, right? So we're dealing with an era that is unabashed about, even if you are allowed to be a citizen, that white is on top. And not just with respect to black, but with others. And so the Anti-Immigration Act of 1914 expands beyond Chinese, expands it beyond East Asians to all from the Asiatic borders, right? All from the Asiatic borders. And most were entirely excluded. Others had quotas that only allowed a certain amount in. The interesting thing about 1914 is we are in full sway of social Darwinism and the eugenics movement. And not only that, you're dealing with World War I, World War II coming about. This is when whiteness gets tight. So the history of whiteness is very interesting here, because included of the groups that were excluded or at least limited in the Anti-Immigration Act of 1914, well, first of all, North Africans, so this idea of Egypt and others, whether or not Egyptians or Middle Easterners were white, which was a question in the 20th century, was resolved against Middle Easterners, and also Italians, Greeks, Spain. The argument, you weren't white enough, right? That when it comes to, and you can also see in this perhaps the dismantling of whiteness that we're perhaps seeing today, at least starting there. That Nazism itself exposes the ridiculousness of whiteness. If you, for those that may not know, Germany in the 20s, 30s, and 40s had fewer colonies than most others, right? And then we could also include Sweden, Denmark, Eastern Europe. They had far less colonies than Spain, France, Italy, and England. So here's the thing, logically speaking, if white people are superior, then how do the swarthy European countries have more possessions than the blonde-haired, blue-eyed European countries? If whiteness is superior, and this is part of the Nazi ideology, then give up all that stuff. That's ours, right? It's our right to take it from those even Europeans that are not quite white enough. So this idea of whiteness contracts and contracts and contracts until you have just only this small population that claims the true whiteness. And perhaps there is where we see the cracks in the foundation that leads to the crevices and the gaps and the valleys that we see now, where white supremacy and whiteness is, at least from a global condition, is challenged, and where it's going to go in the 21st century is uncertain, or at least that's from my perspective. But again, racial exclusion at the time, you have the Anti-Immigration Act of 1914. It gets worse, right? We have Korematsu in the 40s. So once we have World War II, we have, even with strict scrutiny, and this case lasted as good law, whatever you were, until what, a couple years ago. And even then, some scholars say they didn't officially or formally repeal it. It was stated in an opinion that if we haven't repealed Korematsu, let us say right now that it's unjustifiable, whatever. But as far as a case that says that there is no justification, or this would not pass strict scrutiny, that, right? Because strict scrutiny says under Equal Protection Clause that we can consider race if there is a compelling government objective, a compelling government interest, and national defense has always been held to be compelling. So the question becomes, as we are now in this 21st century where it seems to be, some will say, I hate to be provocative on this one, but some people will say we're not looking at war in China, that it's already started. That even if we're not in a military war, when we're talking economic sanctions, when we're talking embargoes and boycotts, when we're talking about military exercises in the South China Sea, that even if we aren't firing shots, it has already kind of been declared that we're on opposite sides. And I give you, what was it, less than 2 years ago when President Trump forced the sale of TikTok? Did anybody, and the fact that this was not, I was astounded by the fact that this was not a social political firestorm, right? The justification was given that we don't trust China with the information or the data of young people or teenagers or something. And we moved forward and Wall Street went ahead with forcing a sale. It's hard for me as a critical theorist not to see that was that the beginning of an official declaration of China as an enemy. Whereas for the early 2000s, my mom went to China. I had lots of people. It was supposed for a good 7, 8 to 10 years, it was supposed to be, this is how the world is now progressing. Globalism is, I don't know, I'm not going to say wonderful, but we're advancing to now 10 years later. It seems to be unquestioned that we're not, that the United States and China is not on the same side. And we see also that what's emanating from that, from the COVID virus, from competition over Hong Kong, over Taiwan and whatnot, that we see what anti-Asian violence and hate crimes increasing in the United States. And so one has to wonder, what would the circumstances be and what would the result be if things got much worse and we were to deal with a case like Korematsu again? If we were to deal with a president in 4 years or 8 years who may have an attachment or affinity that Korematsu that the rest of us don't have, right? We only have a couple minutes left. International issues, globalism, human rights, colorism. Again, I have to mention that when we talk about domestic legal issues with Asian, Pacific Americans, affirmative action is a real doozy. It is a real doozy. So as far as the critical coalition and whether that coalition can hold as a big tent CRT versus lawsuits such as this, which seems to put Asians and Black folks against each other, sort of, because the argument goes, affirmative action in Harvard is justified by the idea that the objective numbers or the test scores don't tell the whole story, right? So black people with lower LSAT or SAT scores can get into Harvard if their scores are lower because we can tell the whole story about their background and see how far they strived and know that, or at least guess or assume that this person's brain fires as fast as someone else with higher scores because of the circumstances surrounding their life, I guess, right? That's the justification. Well, if that's the case, then can't Harvard also justify, with the same rationale, admitting white students who have lower scores than Asian students and say the very same thing? Well, I know Asian students have higher scores, but the scores don't say the whole picture, right? That we have to take in all of the circumstances, including what? The fact that my dad used to go here, that I'm a legacy, that or whatever the case may be, that all of a sudden that when it comes to affirmative action to help black folks, we devalue the scores and go for the more comprehensive evaluation, where doing that hurts the inclusion of Asian students who tend to test higher than white students, who want to use the LSAT and the SAT as the sole criterion, right? So how does an affirmative action policy help inclusion for blacks and Asians at the same time? What is the content or definition of equality or the rule of equal protection that says allow black students in even when the numbers aren't necessarily as high as whites, and then also let in Asian students because their scores are higher? Okay, we talked about violence and hate crimes, employment and commercial discrimination, negative media and social stereotypes. Again, that's usually the black-white paradigm. We usually don't talk about Hollywood and television and internet, about social stereotypes with Asians. When's the last time you seen a male Asian actor get the girl at the end of an action movie, right? The hero wins, saves the day with 1 second left before the bomb explodes and saves the damsel in distress. Now, as subordinate as that may be to women, that trope or whatever, think about the fact that you hardly ever see, if it's an Asian superhero or Jet Li or whomever, that at the end they are not going to be able to they're not going to kiss the girl. They're not going to win the damsel in distress, right? And we can broaden that out again about the idea of being sexually attractive, right? That when it comes to Asian men, Asian women, or whatnot, that the stereotype is a certain intelligence or a certain whatever the case may be, or the opposite, the model minority stereotype, right? On the one hand, the negative stereotypes. On the other hand, is there an indignity of the positive stereotypes? The idea that Asians are often used as the example of how to do it in America, that racism isn't that bad in America, that people of color can succeed because all you have to do is do as Asian people do, right? To be used as a hammer against other people of color when Asian people do in fact experience racism, when they do in fact experience, and not all just as an affluent class of folks, that they're, again, since the 70s, 80s, 90s, we have had large influx of Laotians and Cambodians and others that don't fit the affluent stereotype of that my parents or not are business owners and all of that other stuff, right? My goodness. Which leads me to, I'll end it with this, which pushes in two ways. In some respects, some critical race theorists argue that, what about Asians as neutral arbiters? When we talk about narrative, who should be convinced? Who is the neutral decision maker that should be able to listen to a story about the law and say that this is true or not true, or this is moving or not moving as far as justice is concerned? Should it be perhaps Latino folks or Asians? Is there a neutral arbiter for those that aren't white or black and can be therefore objective? Or is that us marginalizing those that are already in the margins and putting them way on the outside? You're not white, you're not critical race, people of color, you're just on the outside judging the rest of us. Is that absolute marginalization? All right, so unfortunately we got to get to Osaka versus Serena. So Kimberly Crenshaw will hopefully forgive us because we're going to see Serena when I think she would support that. But one of the things I want to talk about next week is what makes us good Supreme Court justice. When we talk about writing, when we talk about scholarship, when we talk about CRT, and we talk about the fact there is not an avowed critical race theory judge on any appellate court or the Supreme Court, I for one, when we get to nominating folks, if I'm allowed, I nominate Professor Crenshaw. And so I think one of the things we're going to talk about next week to start this off is what are the qualifications for Supreme Court judges? Who are the next folks? What should they bring to the table? And we'll start that off by talking about Kimberly Crenshaw and others like Professor Bridges, Amani Perry, Leah Epperson, and all that. Thank you. And I will let you go now. I appreciate your attention. Yes. Okay. Yay.
Thank you, Professor. See you on Friday.
All right. Yes, indeed. We'll be speaking on Friday.
Thank you.
Indeed.